Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to our first lecture this year of the Critical Islamic Studies Collective. Before I introduce our speaker, allow me to say a few words about the platform. Critical Islamic Studies is an academic research unit at the Center for Theology and Religious Studies here in Lund. Initially, it was launched in 2021 at MF Norwegian School of Theology. CIS organizes in-person lectures, online webinars, and reading sessions in the fields of pre-modern or classical as well as contemporary Islamic studies, covering the fields of Islamic ethics, philosophy, environment, economic thought, and many others. The research group considers Islamic texts in different languages and theoretical literature on the subject in order to interrogate the nature and the boundaries of the field, as well as to deconstruct Eurocentric hegemonic discourses on Islam and the Muslim world. It is devised as a platform also to further implement research on Islamic studies in Lund more specifically, but also more broadly in Scandinavia, as well as to seek external funding and collaboration avenues. Part of the initiative is also guest lecture series that we try to organize on a regular basis. And some of our past guest lectures were by Wael Halak from Columbia University and Islam Dae from University Berlin, by Lena Salame from Oxford University and Junaid Qadri, University of Illinois at Chicago, and finally by Megan Abbas at Colgate University and Verena Meyer from Leiden University. Today, our guest is Mutaz al-Khatib and Zimeri, who will join us online and will act as a discussant. Professor al-Khatib is an associate professor of Islamic ethics at the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, or KAIL, at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, where he also directs the MA program in applied Islamic ethics. He earned his PhD from the Omdurman Islamic University in 2009 with a dissertation on text-critical hadith studies. He has authored and edited several books contributing significantly to the field of Islamic studies. Some of his works include رد الحديث من جهات المتن، دراسة في مناهج المحدثين والأصوليين, Matan criticism, a study of the methods of traditionists and Muslim jurists, مأزق الدولة بين الإسلاميين والإلمانيين, the dilemma of the state between Islamists and secularists, and قبول الحديث, or the acceptance of hadith. He has also co-edited a number of books in the field of Islamic ethics, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Studies of Islamic Ethics book series at Brill. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Also joining us today online is Zimeri, an associate professor in religious studies at North University and philosopher by training, who is focusing on both the Western canon as well as on Islamic tradition. Thank you, Syed, for joining us as well. A final note on housekeeping, so to speak. I propose the presentation be around 35 minutes, and then Dr. Zimeri will pose a few questions together with me before we open up the floor for the Q&A. For those of you following us online, please use the chat function if you would like to type your question, or you can be quote-unquote promoted to a panelist, and then you can ask the question directly to Professor al-Khatib. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor, and I will share the screen as well. Okay.
Sounds better.
There we go. Maybe.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My pleasure to be here with you. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Sami for this kind invitation. As you know, my presentation will be, the title of my presentation is Mapping Islamic Ethical Sources, a Critical Review. This is the title of the first chapter of my upcoming edited volume. Will be published in the coming December, inshallah. So the book is the edited volume is entitled Key Classical Works on Islamic Ethics. So this chapter was meant to provide a preliminary study about the sources and to set the big picture of the sources of Islamic ethics before we delve into the detailed chapters, the following chapters, that each chapter addresses a key classical works, including Al-Ghazali, Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami, Ibn Taymiyyah, and others, Al-Izzuddin al-Salam and others. Ibn Dunya also. So the volume is composed by 13 chapters. So each chapter addresses a key work that I consider to be one of the key works of Islamic classical Islamic ethics. So before that, this chapter was, is designed to critically evaluate the sources, the classical sources of Islamic ethics, the ethics as a discipline, and how can we identify the sources of ethics as a discipline, not just as a concept. Before, also to prevent the readers to understand that, these are the only key sources. So the book meant to present a selected list, a selected list of these sources that represent several approaches to Islamic ethics in the classical time. The chapter is addressing three key themes, as you can see on the slide on the PowerPoint. So in the first section, in the first theme that I addressed the importance of ethical sources, where I highlighted the necessity. What happened? I didn't. Okay, so the first theme is addressing the importance of ethical sources, where I highlight the necessity of studying and exploring the sources of Islamic ethics. The second one is dedicated to examine how the concept of ethics or Islamic ethics in this context shapes the perception of the field and its foundational sources. So the way that we will identify the concept, what do you mean by Islamic ethics? The way that you will identify the sources. And in the third point or theme, I explored the methods contemporary scholars use to document, analyze, and categorize the sources of Islamic ethics. So I will go briefly point by point, and I will highlight only the key points under each section. And the details are available in my chapter. I think it was circulated in advance by Professor Sami. So now for the first theme, the question of researching ethical sources. The exploration of ethical sources within the Islamic tradition began in the early 20th century. And after analyzing the available discussions over this period, I came to the conclusion that there are three frameworks in this search. The first one is trying to explore the Greek ethics through the classical Islamic sources. So the focus of this approach or framework is the Greek ethics, not the Islamic ethical sources. But because some of the Greek sources were lost, so the only way was available to examine and to trace the Greek ideas is to analyze the classical Islamic sources, because they translated and also interacted with the Greek sources. So the ideal example for this framework is Richard Walzer. In his book, was compiled in 1960, I think. Greek into Arabic. The title of the book is Greek into Arabic. So the second approach is try to establish Islamic ethics as a distinct field, where and to trace its origins and interactions with other traditions. The ideal example here for this framework is Muhammad Yusuf Musa in Egypt in the 1940s. He wrote several works, several books. One of them is in one of them he tried to compare between or to trace the Greek roots of فلسفة الأخلاق, the Islamic moral philosophy. And in another one, he tried to provide a comparative history of Islamic ethics. So he tried to historicize Islamic ethics. Where the book title is في تاريخ الأخلاق. So I think the first edition was تاريخ الأخلاق, and the second edition he added في in the title. So and this book was praised by one of the Egyptian philosophers who wrote appreciating this work in the journal in one of the Egyptian journals at that time. So the third one is trying to identify and the authenticity and the identity, the Arab identity of what he called al-aql al-akhlaqi, the ethical mind. The aim here is to refute the foreign influences and counter political stagnation attributed to external ethical values. The ideal example for this framework is Muhammad Abdel Jabiri, the Moroccan scholar who wrote several books. One of them is entitled Al-Aql al-Akhlaqi al-Arabi, the Arab ethical mind. His aim was clear that he's trying to trace the what he called the pure Arab ethical mind, in addition to other types of minds that he identified in his reading to the classical sources, and the pure Islamic mind, ethical mind also. So he used. I will give more details about this work later at the end of my presentation. So now, how also discussing Islamic ethics was, or discussing Islamic ethical sources has four aspects to identify. In my opinion, one of these aspects is a historical perspective. And the historical perspective is based on or relies on the historian's perception of or viewpoint of what ethics is. Usually, some of these scholars who try to write a history of Islamic ethics, they relied or selected key figures, and they try to write the history of Islamic ethics through these key figures. But with the lack of a full consideration of the historical context and and placing or contextualizing these figures within the history of ideas. One of these works is also written by Muhammad Yusuf Musa, for example, the scholar that I have mentioned before. The second aspect to analyze Islamic ethics is theoretical considerations or theoretical approach. The perception of ethical sources as rich or scarce depends on how ethics is conceptualized, as I mentioned before. So with the theoretical conceptualization of ethics, we are among, we cannot avoid key questions or challenging questions that we need to answer to have a theoretical approach to ethics. One of these questions, I think, are we searching for a specific style when we search for sources, classical sources? Are we searching for a specific style of writing, or which is in this case the Greek style of philosophical ethics? If this is the case, then the way that we will identify the sources, it will be different from the way if we will identify ethics as in a broader sense. And if we will trace also other styles of writing. Also, are we searching for theoretical ethics, or also we include applied ethics or practical ethics? So the way that we will answer these questions, it will affect our identification of the classical sources, ethical sources. Now, the third aspect for analyzing ethics is analytical approach. Here, the focus would be on the content of the sources that we are addressing, and the comparative analysis that we make between one classical source and another, either within the Islamic tradition or outside, between the Islamic tradition and other traditions, religious or moral traditions. The last one is the methodological approach. The edited volume that I have mentioned before provides a representative selection of sources that includes analyzing perspectives on Islamic ethical sources, such as scriptural, philosophical, theological, Sufi, and jurisprudential sources. So I intentionally try to cover several approaches to ethics in this volume to demonstrate that the moral rationality is wider than the Greek one. And we should not restrict ourselves and our view only to the Greek style. So, because also that theoretical analysis is not restricted only to the field of philosophy in the technical sense. And also we cannot ignore also the practical ethics, where we have a huge number of classical sources addressing what we identify or classify nowadays as practical advices or practical ethics. Because I believe that these sources implicitly they underline theoretical visions that we need to analyze and explore. So we cannot just restrict ourselves to the Greek style and theoretical one theoretical way or one type of rationality. So now I'll move to the second theme, Islamic ethics as an academic field. The key developments in modern ethical studies highlight two prominent perspectives that define the scope of Islamic ethics as a discipline. The restrictive one and the expansive one. As for the restrictive perspective, in this view, this view limits ethics to the Greek tradition of philosophical inquiry. And the focus of ethics in this view is only on the self-discipline and governance by examining the self, its powers, virtues, and vices. The core characteristics of ethics through this view is to emphasize rationality, theoretical inquiry, the systematic methodology as essential to ethical philosophy. And the best example for this perspective is Miskawayh's Tahdhib al-Akhlaq, refining character, which was considered the pinnacle of Islamic philosophical ethics. So the critique that we might attribute to this view, narrow view, is that it overlooks ethical materials in broader Islamic sources, including Quran, Hadith, theology, Islamic law, and legal theory, adab literature and Sufi writings. So where we find an intensive and rich discussions about ethics that we cannot ignore. The second approach is expansive perspective on Islamic ethics. So it broadens the boundaries of ethics to include discussions from related disciplines such as Kalam, Sufism, Fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, Usul Fiqh, Islamic legal theory, adab genre, where we have several types of adab in the Islamic tradition. And also there's the general adab, etiquette, or a field, or the adab attached to each discipline also, where we find a rich tradition or rich discussions on Islamic ethics. So based on this expansive perspective, Islamic ethics focuses or addresses three key points: the self-disciplining, cultivating virtues and moral character, and assessment of human actions, where we evaluate deeds and intentions. And the third point is diverse sources drawing from a wide range of fields to assist the ethical developments. So in this case, when we say ethics, we are referring to not only the character or the doer, but also the actions and the sources that help us to answer the questions related to to identifying the moral character traits and in evaluating also the actions. So in the first one, we are among virtue ethics. Self-disciplining. In the second one, we are among the ethics of actions or deontology ethics, and in the third one, we are among meta ethics, where we analyze the moral language that we use to evaluate an action or to evaluate a character trait, and also we are among the sources that we derive our moral judgment through. Now, the restrictive view, how perspectives on ethics shape the identification of sources. As I mentioned before, the way that we define ethics, the way that we identify the sources, because there's a very strong link between the concept and the sources. So with the restrictive view, so we are only following and tracing the Greek style of ethics. So in this case, the conclusion will be that the sources, the Islamic contribution to ethics based on this perspective is scarce and is minimal. Why? Because we are searching for a specific style of writing on ethics in the Islamic tradition. And this is the conclusion that, for example, Cardiveau came to in his study, in his entry in the Encyclopedia of Islam, the first edition in 1913, I think. So this was his conclusion at that time, because he restricted ethics only to the Greek style and the way that Greek philosophers followed. But if we will follow only this style, then we will lose and exclude significant sources of ethical materials, such as books of testaments, wasaya, collections of proverbs and wisdoms, advice literature for kings and princes, treatises on asceticism and piety, hadith compilations, and literary works. The last year or the year before, I have published an edited volume on Hadith and ethics, which is the first volume in addressing this area, the relationship between Hadith and ethics, because Hadith was excluded intensively from all the studies almost all the studies of dedicated for Islamic ethics, because usually they don't recognize the hadith sources. Where I also attached to the book an annotated bibliography for only to list the classical sources on hadith and ethics, which includes a huge number of sources, classical sources, from the 2nd century till 11th century, for example. So this was one of the fields that was excluded from the contemporary developments on Islamic studies, Islamic ethics, I mean. Now, with the expanding ethical thinking, so we multiplied sources of ethical thought by including broader cultural and intellectual legacies. Ethical thinking encompasses, based on this perspective, it encompasses 3 key aspects: cultural legacies, Islamic knowledge fields, and diverse forms and methodologies. So the scope of ethics was expanded and became became wider than the narrow one. So the expansion of ethical studies went beyond, or it has redefined ethics beyond its traditional boundaries. And ethics is no longer limited to being a branch of philosophy, because in this case, the rationality is not restricted only to philosophy in the technical sense. And also we are in this case we are tracing several types of approaches to ethics and several types of rationality, as I mentioned, moral rationality. Now I will move to the third point. I think I took much time. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So the third point is the ethical sources from a contemporary perspective. Okay, I forgot. I'm moving from my PowerPoint. That's for one time. Okay, sorry. This is the problem. Yeah. Something. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it was my mistake. I thought there, I forgot that I'm dealing with 2 different platforms.
Yes, it will be published online and it's
okay.
So people can.
Anyway, so the third point is dedicated for ethical sources from a contemporary perspective. How contemporary scholars who address the issue of the sources, the ethical, classical ethical, Islamic classical sources on ethics, how did they identify the sources? So because with the expansion of ethics beyond its traditional confines, there was a new challenge about the way that we identify the sources. Then should we consider every classical source part of as a source of ethics? Otherwise, if we will do so, then ethics has no unique character, or it has no borders, and then we cannot, then everything would be ethics. But this is not the case if we are talking about the ethics as an academic or a distinct discipline. Now, the expansion of ethical studies broadened the concept of ethics since the mid-20th century, and through several scholars, those who are coming from philosophical background, and those who are coming from other backgrounds. And 2 novel developments can be traced here: the interdisciplinary interaction and rationality beyond philosophy, as I mentioned before. because of the time, I will move quickly to stress key points about these contemporary studies or approaches to the classical sources on Islamic ethics. The first one is Muhammad Abdullah Draz in the 1940s. He provided a critical assessment of ethical sources, where he found that the Islamic library on ethics is or contains the two levels: the individual writings and the ethical discussions found in several branches of Islamic knowledge, including theology, Sufism, and fiqh. His evaluation of the sources, the available sources for Islamic ethics, was that these ethical discussions spread across fields, hindered the development of a unified ethical doctrine, and they marginalized the Quranic ethics in their addressing to Islamic ethics. So this is why he intended to provide a Quranic ethical theory or a Quranic theory for ethics, because he thought that Quran was almost absent in the previous studies dedicated for ethics. Muhammad Abdullah Draz actually, he confined ethics to a philosophical framework, paralleling European models in structure, and he excluded practical ethics texts, limiting ethical sources to two categories, despite the broader diversity of sources in the Islamic tradition. The second figure in this context is Majid Fakhri. Majid Fakhri published two key works in this regard. The first one was in 1978 in Arabic. So it was entitled Al-Fikr al-Akhlaqi al-Arabi. So where he compiled several classical texts, and it was published in 2 volumes. In this book, Al-Fikr al-Akhlaqi al-Arabi, Arab Ethical Thought, he focused on texts by jurists, theologians, and philosophers. He broadened the definition of ethical thought, integrating theological discussions with individual ethical texts. So here he did not restrict himself to the individual writings on ethics, and he went beyond the philosophical style by including some part of for example, Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar's book Al-Mughni, dedicated for some ethical dimensions within theology. So he expanded the scope of ethics in this book. The second book was published in 1991. It is entitled Ethical Theories in Islam, where he reclassified ethical sources into 4 categories: scriptural morality, religious ethics, theological ethics, and philosophical ethics. My critique to the work of Majid Fakhri is that the classification he provided in the first book was problematic. He included works that belong to Islamic theology, but others, such as those by Al-Mawardi, Ibn Hazm, and Al-Raghib and Al-Razi, do not strictly fall under Islamic jurisprudence, because the subtitle was Al-Mutakallimun wal-Fuqaha. So theologians and Muslim jurists. But the works that he included in this volume, they were not. We cannot classify them under the title of fiqh or the discipline of fiqh. So also he limited in his second book the focus. He focused on ethical thought, in his second book, he focused on ethical thought, الفكر الخلقي, which restricted his analysis by leaving out ethical literature, الأدب الخلقي. So we don't find the huge classical number of classical sources on adab in his book. For example, Ibn al-Muqaffa, al-Jahil, and Ibn Abd Rabbi and others. They were not included in his second book because he excluded this type of writings on ethics. And he was not clear about why did he excluded all these types, and he focused on these categories. And even the his categorization was not coherent in my opinion. I might in the discussion give more details about this. And Fakhri's approach is more limited than Donaldson. MacDonald Donaldson in 1953 published a book called Muslim Ethics. He included in Muslim ethics, several, like even Persian writers and poetries and Sufi poets and ascetics. So he widened the scope of ethics in his book, and he also addressed contemporary Islamic ethics in addressing the Muhammad Iqbal, Muhammad Abdu, and others. Even in his book, he tried to analyze the contemporary ethics in his time. But this is not the case with Al-Jabiri, with Mu'ajid Fakhri and others, because they restricted themselves only to the classical period of time. And he also omitted Muslim jurists Fakhri omitted Muslim jurists from his second book, although that he wrote in the subtitle Al-Mutakallimun al-Fuqaha, Muslim Jurists and Theologians, or Theologians and Muslim Jurists. But in the second work, he did not mention at all Muslim jurists and Islamic law. Muhammad al-Kun also in 1980s, he published several works. We know that his main thesis was on Miskawi also. He published other articles on several moral philosophers. His ethical writings divided into, based on his view, ethical writings divided into two categories: narrative normative and analytical normative. So with narrative normative, he included adab and Sufism, and with analytical normative, he included theology and philosophy. So he expanded the concept, the scope of ethics, and also he included social, cultural, and political aspects of ethics, because his book was focusing on al-akhlaq wa siyasa, ethics and politics. So he wanted to trace the implicit values that are reflected in the wide classical sources, including the sources on fatwa, on or even aqdiya, judiciary judgments, and other types of writings. Now, the last one, I think, I will stop here after this figure. Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri, the one I have mentioned earlier. Yeah, it was a big mistake that we'll have two laptops. Yes, Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri. So the last one is Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri. So Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri in 2001, he provided a kind of a historical analysis of the what he called al-aql al-akhlaqi al-Arabi, the Arab ethical mind, But actually, if you dig in the book, you will find him providing summaries and analytical outlines of numerous sources from the Arab and Islamic ethical tradition, placing them within a historical context. So it is actually the book is a kind of a set of book analysis or summaries. So his work proposes the existence of parallel value systems in Islamic heritage, each centered around a key value based on his analysis. For example, he provided or he categorized the ethical thought into under four categories: Persian heritage, Greek heritage, Arabian heritage, and Islamic heritage. So, and under each heritage is centralized based on his view, is centralized on a key value. For example, the Persian heritage is centralized on obedience. Greek heritage is centralized on happiness. Arabian heritage is centralized on manliness, al-muru'ah, and Islamic heritage is centralized on maslaha. So, and under each category, he tried to, to list some classical sources that are, they reflect, this tradition or heritage that based on his analysis. So I think that the way that he classified the sources is very problematic when we go in details, because he imposed and the classical sources to fall under just one category, and sometimes some sources are included to fall under several categories. What doesn't make sense about the categorization. So Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri, Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri's work is inconsistent. He provided inconsistent historicization, although that acknowledging intermingling, al-Jabiri does not fully historicize these value systems or accurately classify ethical sources under one heritage. He also fragmented the sources, some of the sources, classical sources. For example, Nasihat al-Muluk by al-Mawardi is classified in his book as both Persian content and Greek structure, while Adab al-Dunya wal-Din by al-Mawardi is placed under Persian, Arabian, and Islamic heritage. So he fragmented the texts to fall under one or more than one heritage based on his classification, regardless the message of the author and the structure of the book that he is analyzing. So also he omitted significant contributions from scholars like Ibn Sina, Ikhwan al-Safa, الجاحظ ابن أبي الدنيا التوحيدي أو أحيان توحيدي نصير الدين الطوسي جلال الدين الدواني فخر الدين الرازي and others. So he overlooked all the works of all these authors. So it was not really a history or an accurate history of Islamic ethics or what he called ethical mind, Arab ethical mind. So finally, Islamic ethics has evolved from a focused discipline to a broader interdisciplinary field. And several contemporary scholars since the early 20th century have significantly and gradually shaped the study of Islamic ethics, despite existing methodological gaps. A comprehensive understanding of Islamic ethical sources requires integrating various branches of Islamic knowledge, this is what I term as interdisciplinarity, and also critically engage with Greek and Western moral discussions, which I term transdisciplinarity. So Islamic ethics, in my view, and based on the approach that I follow, is that it combines between interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. With interdisciplinarity, we go through the huge moral tradition within the Islamic branches of knowledge, and with the transdisciplinarity, we critically engage with the other moral traditions, either in the Greek philosophy or the contemporary Western moral philosophies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Khatib. This was, I think, a very rich and very detailed account. And also, for those of you who have read the text, I think it's a very useful and beneficial source material, not only for those of us sort of who are dealing with Islamic ethics more specifically, but also broadly when it comes to intellectual history and Islamic studies on a more general level. Now, before I pose a question or two, Syed, are you ready? Do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Sorry, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sami. And thank you, Dr. Mutaz, for this really rich and detailed lecture. And I had the opportunity to read your text also, which I thought was really well written and well argued. By training, I'm a philosopher. So whenever somebody speaks against or sort of tries to make light of a philosophical ethics or try to sort of, in one way or another, not make it the primary branch of ethics somehow, I sort of get tickled a bit, and I want to engage with that. If you, nevertheless, today Sami has given me very strict instructions to be very short. Otherwise, really, this is such a wonderful paper and invites, I think, debates, a very long exchange of views and debates, but hopefully others can raise other questions. So I'll try to be as focused as I can. I'll restrict myself to two questions. One is really has to do, well, what's in a name? That's the question, really. I mean, we spoke about Islamic ethics, identifying the sources, the categories, but after I read your paper and after listening to you now, it's not really clear to me, what is Islamic ethics? Well, you mentioned, for example, that it's Islamic ethics usually identified by the character of the individuals and by the actions, the virtue ethics, deontology, and the sources, which is a kind of a meta-ethical debate, which I would have also very much enjoyed, this meta-ethical part of debate there. But then I was thinking, but this is also what we in the West, for example, that's what I teach my students, what ethics is. When I speak to them about ethics, I usually go to this I make more or less this classic division of ethics. And so the question is, is Islamic ethics something that we identify merely by the sources, merely by going to the sources themselves, or does it have something else? What are the elements? Because you seem to exclude, for example, we speak of Kantian ethics, so we immediately say, well, it is some ways a very rationalistic ethics, and it's related to how, Kant grounds it in the categorical imperative. So what is that defining element? What's in a name that I can say that when I see that this is Islamic ethics and this is not really Islamic ethics? No, I know you provide very useful methodological point there by dividing into restrictive and expansive. And I think that's a real step forward. Nevertheless, I had the impression that, when we say that expansive, well, first of all, by what criteria? What is included and what is excluded? For example, I saw that you didn't mention poetry, you didn't mention folklore, you didn't mention oral tradition, you didn't mention fatwa literature, for example, just some examples of which could be part of ethical moral traditions. So by what criteria, for example, would we exclude this, or by what criteria would we include this and exclude perhaps certain other sources? So that's my first question. Kind of, we thought, how do you envision navigating these boundaries without being either reductive or exclusionary? So that's my first question regarding the second question is about Muhammad Abid al-Jabiri. I know Muhammad al-Jabiri. I had the opportunity once to meet him in person, and I have read the Naqd al-Aql al-Arabi, and and I loved a lot of what you said. It is very true, and it has been kind of also debated a lot. Also, when he wrote the book, a lot about his approaches, you know, particularly essentializing lots of tradition, which really perhaps, you know, shouldn't have been done, and in the name of historicizing all the more that. But I wondered though, when I read your paper, if the critique that you make of Muhammad Abid al-Jabiri maybe is too focused on what is missing rather than what he achieves. Now, I understand that that's part of the paper, you know, to find out, you know, what these writers kind of how they categorize and what they kind of why the categorizations do not work. But I to my mind, al-Jabri was primarily focused on analyzing value system in Arab culture rather than producing a comprehensive ethical framework. So this is the perspective which I would think was essential for al-Jabri. So how do you think his work could be viewed as complementary to other scholarly efforts rather than as incomplete or flawed? That might sort of, and another sub-question, or not sub-question, but just a comment related to that would be, can't we view his value systems, or I mean, don't you think that his value systems have the potential for dialogue with other traditions? You know, could this be an aspect, for example, which could be worth exploring further? And last question is a sub-question really of the second question. What are the criteria? Because you say that, well, his categorizations, you know, miss lots of, you know, leave out too much and include perhaps things that shouldn't be included. And perhaps, you know, his identification of those main values which he identified with each specific tradition, like, for example, Persian heritage, obedience is the main value. But how did he come to this? By what criteria did he come? Because I do not think that they were somehow haphazard, you know, that they were based on idiosyncratic reading of al-Jabiri, which I think your paper, perhaps in other places you explored more, but in your paper it seemed that al-Jabiri's classification seemed more like idiosyncratic and not really well thought than a process of a certain epistemological and philosophical approach to this tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shad.
Thank you very much for your comments. First of all, I think the focus of the chapter is clear that it is on the sources, not on the concept. But the way that I addressed the concept was just to serve, to the extent that it serves, explaining the focus, which is the sources of Islamic ethics. Because as I mentioned before, that this is the first chapter of the edited volume on key classical works on Islamic ethics. But if you would like to know what Islamic ethics is, then other sources are available to discuss this point in my work, and I recently have written 25,000 explaining the concept of ethics, and this is supposed to be published in a volume with George Tamer and others. So just to clarify the concept of ethics, what is Islamic ethics? You know, so the focus here and the title of the lecture is on the sources, because there is a problem in identifying the sources, and as you can see in my chapter, you know, that our knowledge of the classical sources, you know, developed. So now we know much better than al-Jabri, Fakhri, others about the sources. Huh? So if I were, Al-Jabiri harshly criticized the previous scholars because they didn't know the sources that he knew. Now, and he missed, and now I'm criticizing him because he missed a lot of classical sources. And there might be in the future, one come and then, I've been collecting classical sources that I classify as classical sources on Islamic ethics since a few years now. I have hundreds. That you will never find any mention about some of them in these works, for example. I'm still, because I have the plan to publish an annotated bibliography on the classical sources on Islamic ethics. So this is why I'm still hesitated and I'm still exploring. It is a developing project. So now, as for the, you are right. I teach. I'm not just to get me right. I'm not disregarding the discipline of philosophy, because I teach a course, theological and philosophical ethics, to the MS students, and I've been teaching this course for several years. And I teach Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, Abu Bakr al-Razi. I mean. Farabi and others. So with the focus of their ethical contributions. And recently I read with my MA students the work of Miskawayh intensively, week by week, to analyze the work, his work, using the Arabic text and the English text together. So it's not disregarding the value of philosophy, no, but what I'm saying that, the philosophical thinking is different from philosophy. So our rationality is wider than the Greek rationality. This is what I'm saying now. So rationality is not restricted only to the field of philosophy in the technical sense, because when we read Islamic legal theory and this Islamic law literature, there's a kind of intensive rationality in these works. So what I'm saying that we need to widen the scope of ethics when we talk about Islamic ethics, because Islamic ethics is an integral part of this thought, distributed in several disciplines within the Islamic studies, including what is termed as Islamic philosophy. Now, what makes different? When we say ethics, so it's not necessary to have different components from the Greek, or the philosophical, component of ethics, but the details and the sources and the worldview is different. And this is clear from the contribution made by Al-Ghazali, for example, in his Mizan al-Amal, the criterion of action. The criterion of action, if you compare this work, for example, with Miskawayh's work, there's a huge difference, because Miskawayh is just trying to reconcile, to introduce Greek philosophy, moral philosophy within the Islamic context with the slight modifications, to be reconciliated with Sharia in the general sense. But when you read Al-Ghazali, you are among a Muslim scholar who is trained in several disciplines, an encyclopedic scholar, dealing with, mastering all these fields and trying to provide the Islamic component in clarifying what Islamic ethics is. So in my view, Al-Ghazali and Al-Izz ibn Abdussalam, for example, are the best examples to provide ethics as an interdisciplinary field. And this is one of the chapters that would be published in the book, in the upcoming book on Al-Izz ibn Abdussalam for the first time, when I demonstrate that Al-Izz is providing in his 3 key works that I have analyzed in the chapter, Shajaratul Ma'arif wal Ahwal, the tree of knowledge and states, الإحكام في مصالح الأنام في إصلاح الأنام I forget the first part of the title. في إصلاح الأنام.
عبد السلام.
Yes, عز الدين عبد السلام. I forget the first part of the title. And the third one is الإمام في بيان أدلة الأحكام. Okay, I will remember the title. So in these three key works, Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam, Izz al-Din Abd Salam, who died 660, is providing an Islamic ethics as an interdisciplinary approach in our language, in our terminology nowadays. Al-Ghazali did the same one almost 1 century before Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam. So this is what I'm working on now to in another chapter to clarify and to demonstrate how Al-Ghazali is providing a unique approach to ethics, to Islamic ethics. قواعد الأحكام في إصلاح الأنام. So the popular title is في مصالح الأنام, but based on the manuscripts that we know, several manuscripts we know for this book, it is إصلاح الأنام, which is much better than مصالح الأنام. It is because what ethics is about is to refining the character. Yeah, refining the character, the moral character. So again, if you trace the classical conception of ethics, either the Greek or the classical Islamic philosophy of ethics, or khuluq, actually, khuluq. So it's different. It cannot be translated into ethics in the modern sense. So khuluq or akhlaq in the classical terminology is not equal to ethics. Because with ethics, we mean something different. Khuluq is moral character, moral or character traits. So in the classical terminology, but now when we use ethics, we refer to a complex or the complex relationship between the character and the actions. So this is why, for example, the two key theories in Western moral philosophy over the 19th century and 20th century so far, till now, are deontology and utilitarianism. There are some, recently, at least two or three other theories, but still they are not dominant.
Virtue ethics is quite dominant.
Yes, but virtue ethics is the classical one, not just a new one. So deontology and utilitarianism. Now there is another turn to the classical view, which was virtue ethics. By the way, when we use khuluq or akhlaq in the Greek philosophy and the classical Islamic philosophy, virtue was the umbrella, and ethics, what we call ethics, was part of the virtue ethics. And the shift happened in the Western tradition, that they shifted from virtue ethics to ethics of action, deontology and utilitarianism. Now there is another turn to the classical view, which is virtue ethics, because virtue ethics, get busy with the character, with the big questions. What are the ultimate goals that you are seeking for? Which type of person you would like to be? These big questions are not part of modernity in our modern context, And this is why Alistair McIntyre and others are going back to the Greek tradition. And by the way, this was the key focus in the Islamic, the classical Islamic philosophy and the Greek tradition also. When they address ethics, they refer to the character, not to the actions, because there is a complex relationship between the character, which is and the actions. So, if you would like, in the classical perspective, if you would like to enhance your actions, then you have to change your character. And then, if you would like to get to behave in a right way or a correct way or proper way, then you have to do some changes in your character through habituation. So again, so to change your character, then you have to regularly acquire habit and repeating the same actions for several times for a certain limit of time till this action is internalized and will do some changes in your character. And the same, if you act properly or not properly, then there's something in your soul that you have to change, because this reflects the vices or virtues that you have internally. So the relationship between the character and the actions it's very complicated, and it doesn't go one way. Doesn't go one way. So now there's no change between different moral traditions in this regard, by the way, Islamic or Greek or other traditions. But the way that how you address these. Now, with the Sufi approach to ethics is totally different from the Greek one. And the Sufi approach to ethics is different, totally different from the Fiqhi approach to ethics. Because the Faqih, the Muslim jurist, focuses only on the actions and the way that to regulate these actions to be proper based on Sharia. But the Sufi focuses on the inner aspect and inner actions, to reach the perfection. So Muslim jurist is not interested in perfection. This is why usually he moves from the minimum to the maximum. And he offers to the general public several options, and they will choose. They can choose whatever they like to do, but at least he clarifies the minimum and the maximum. But the Sufi is different. He reaches and ultimately, seek for the perfection. And this is why the permissible is a crucial point or area where the Sufi and the jurist disagree.
If I may sort of jump in and maybe build on that a little bit before we open the floor for other questions. Thinking about the concept, thinking about the sources, I'm thinking about the field or the discipline itself. And if I were sort of to play devil's advocate, push back a little bit, can we really talk about Islamic ethics or Islamic ethical science as a separate field? And what I'm thinking about here is, as you pointed out in your presentation, in your text as well, you notice ethical reasoning in almost every branch in science, from tasawwuf to fiqh to usul al-fiqh to kalam to falsafa and beyond, right? Even Abdurrahman Taha says, La akhlaq bi khayri al-insan, right? There is no ethics without human being and our own sort of actions. This ties a little bit, to what Lena Salaim also tries to sort of questions and critiques the field, the modern field, the contemporary field of Islamic ethics, saying that it's situated within the context of secularism and how secularism reshapes the notion of law and then consequently divorces law from morality or law from ethics, right? Because it's due to the imposition on the very notion of religion as a colonial concept. So to what extent can we really talk about the modern field of Islamic ethics that it's on one hand interrelated to all these branches and schools of thought and movements, but on the other hand yet something separate, right? Maybe if you can just briefly touch upon that, and then we can.
So I disagree with Lina Salama because she's busy with
legal
Western discussions and which is not involved in the classical discussions. Because when we talk about ethics, we are the book that I'm talking about, and the book on Hadith and ethics and other books that even when we talk about a scholar like Ibn Muflih, the Hanbali scholar in the 8th century, he himself wrote a book entitled Al-Furu', and then wrote another book called Al-Adab Shar'iyya. So he himself differentiated between what is hukm and what is adab. The same person wrote two different books. So now, and when we talk about Al-Raghib al-Asfahani, the scholar who died, we are not sure about when he died, but he died in the 5th century, almost. He differentiated between what he called makarim al-sharia and ahkam al-sharia, the noble character of sharia and the ruling of sharia. So this differentiation has nothing to do with the secularism. So even within the fiqh discussions, the classical fiqh discussions, they differentiate between the something that is correct, صحيح, صحة, and something is مجزئ. So they give several examples. They themselves, طلاق الزواج بدي الطلاق, for example, in the classical discussions, the marriage contract in with the intention of discontinuity. If you trace the classical discussions about the evaluating this type of contract, you will find them differentiating between the legal procedures and the moral aspects. For example, Malik ibn Anas, the great jurist who died 179, he said that it is correct, legally speaking, but morally speaking, it is immoral. ليس من مكارم الأخلاق. So what he is talking about, So I'm not. We can dedicate one lecture about this differentiation. But this does not mean, that we are, and the historical development of the concept of ethics that I'm talking about, and I in detail addressed in my recent research. So we'll clarify, that ethics is a discipline. And there's another article that I have written recently and will be published in Turkey on ethics as a discipline and how it was recognized during the Ottoman period as a distinct discipline. So also there are a lot of details. The detailed answer will be in my publications. Inshallah.
Okay. Any questions, comments, or thoughts before we give maybe some time to the online participants as well? We have 30 minutes or so. So please. You have some more too. I will get it. We might have to answer.
I was wondering, I'm not a specialist in this at all, but we have a philosophical discipline called ethics. And you have demonstrated that the people who started looking at Islamic ethics in sort of modern times, largely Western scholars, but also Muslim scholars, some of them had a very limited idea of what ethics was, defined by Aristotle and the Greek tradition. And then you have demonstrated how gradually Muslim scholars and maybe also non-Muslim scholars realize that if we are looking at the Muslim tradition, it's far richer. There's a lot of ethics in numerous other genres. And I guess something similar happened in Western scholarship, that some persons at some point said, now look at this ethics, at least if we look at it in a historical perspective, in the Middle Ages, for instance, it must be much, much wider than what we would find in philosophical treatises and so on. So maybe there was the same sort of expansion of understanding of ethics. And then we move on to today, where you're discussing a number of different treatments of ethics by modern scholars like Akun and Jabri and Fakhri and so on, who have expanded it somewhat, but maybe insufficiently so. And Fakhri, for instance, doesn't he call it Arabic? And I was wondering, there's a big Christian Arabic tradition of ethics. Is it nowhere to be found in this? But you are focusing on an Islamic specifically. Are you doing this to look at all these sources to tell people that we can sort of navigate within these sources to make a new Islamic ethics? Because I think some people, some fuqaha or some intellectuals, and maybe I would count you among those, they have been also looking at new sources of fiqh to use new to make a modern and more progressive fiqh, but still linked to the Islamic tradition. Some, for instance, have been interested in how we should not just look at the fuqaha, we should look at the courts, how they were actually practicing. Some have been looking at adab as part of it. Some have said that, like you also said now, that the sunnah was actually something you were brought up with from your sheikh. So it was ingrained in your body in the end. So how do we deal with these other types of sources to make a modern fiqh where we can tackle many modern issues, looking back at our extremely rich tradition, which is far richer than what the Salafis thinks and maybe what the Mazhabis thinks and so on. Are you doing the same with ethics now? I was wondering, because you're interested in all these different kinds of contributions to ethics in a much wider sense, from Sufi genres to adab to many other genres. Is that to sort of open up a big register for formulating a future-looking ethics?
This is an interesting question, John. First of all, we're trying to establish a field called Islamic ethics as a discipline, and this is why we established the Journal of Islamic Ethics, the book series Studies in Islamic Ethics, but at the same time, we believe that myself and my colleagues in the center, we believe that we cannot establish applied ethics unless you have a very concrete and solid theoretical foundation and foundational ethics. So because we think, applied and theoretical are intertwined. So otherwise, if you do applied ethics without having theoretical foundations, then it will be very superficial, like so many studies on Mutaz Sharia and, in several disciplines in bioethics and economics, whatever, are very superficial. So we try to combine both. This is number one. So number two, that applied ethics is an expanding discipline where you need to apply, you need to provide answers and evaluations for current issues and questions that you are facing nowadays in terms of artificial intelligence, bioethics, and political ethics. And I teach a course for the MA students. It's called Political Ethics, Islamic Political Ethics, Peace, War, and Political Ethics. So I've been teaching this course for several years now, which is very linked with the classical discussions about politics and the contemporary discussions. Where we link the classical discussions with the contemporary discussions and on issues that are happening nowadays. And with bioethics, for example, we have something called a subfield was developed during over the last 20 years so far, which is Islamic bioethics, which is very developed now. And it has, there's something, concrete foundations to build upon. So this is number one. Number two, the intertwining between theoretical and applied. The second point is related to that the relationship between ethics and fiqh. I think that ethics is the umbrella and fiqh is part of ethics. So when we talk about Islamic ethics, it's not just fiqh approach. Because I included, as I said, we have in the Islamic tradition, we have several approaches to ethics. The fiqh approach is just one of them. The Sufi approach is another one. So when we talk, the question was, what is Islamic ethics? So I don't agree, I disagree with, imposing Islamic ethics to fall under just one of the Western theories. No, I cannot. This is why there was a discussion about how do you identify maqad Sharia, the higher objective of Sharia, Is it a utilitarian theory? Is it a divine command theory? Is it I don't know what? I think Maqal Sharia cannot be classified under just one of these theories because it's not. Although that you can collect several elements within the discussions, the classical discussions of Maqal Sharia, to demonstrate that it is classified under this theory or that theory. But this is not the case because the complexity of Maqal Sharia does not support the idea of classifying it under just one Western theory. So the same with, there's a huge diversity when it comes to Islamic ethics in the Islamic tradition, the classical Islamic tradition, and we have several approaches. And this is what I'm trying to demonstrate in the upcoming book.
To jump on that, then, I mean, this brings us a little bit back on also what Said was, I think, trying to point out. Maybe the better designation would be to omit the whatever it's rendered into English as in Islamic ethics and call it akhlaq or call it adab for that matter as well, right? Because looking back into scholars such as Al-Isfahani or Al-Ghazali, and again, they're navigating various fields, right? They're polymaths by common definitions. But really, I see them first and foremost as ethicists, whether they're navigating through Sufism or Tasawwuf or Kalam, Ilm al-Kalam, and so forth. So maybe when it comes to designation and name and categorization, it would be called that even the journal and then the book series, right? It's the book series on akhlaq or the book series on adab. Adab as a broad concept that doesn't deal only with literature, but also with the moral characteristics of the self. So maybe this is something that could be a way out of when we come to the translations, how concepts and terms are rendered into English, either appropriately or inappropriately.
Yeah, but in the modern Arabic, they use akhlaq as ethics.
Yes.
So
yes.
the content was changed. You know, the term khuluq was developed within the Arabic language itself. So this is why I was referring to the classical Arabic. I was intentionally referring to this because in the contemporary Arabic also we use akhlaq to refer to the moral philosophy.
Yes.
You see? So, but we have to be cautious, I think, when we read the classical sources to get them properly. Yeah.
And the same issues with the notion of iqtisad, which is a completely different understanding of modern classical versus
the same with siyasa.
It's not politics. It didn't mean politics. Any other comments or questions?
Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah.
What would be the concept and role of ijtihad in contemporary situation? I think, accepting all that discussion, what we had about various sources, the critics of the Islamic ethics, looking at the present situation of the human beings' live life, and in the Islamic perspective, what would the role of ijtihad?
In which sense? The fiqh ijtihad or which ijtihad?
Now, that's again another issue that has been raised. When we talk about ijtihad, we try to categorize politics, fiqh, sharia, adab, and all this. In all fields, because we require that. We cannot stick to the old traditions and conceptions. As you rightly said, there has to be critique about the sources also, concepts also. The same thing what was there hundreds of years before cannot be applicable now, right? In the practical sense. Maybe you can have a broader framework, but within the broader framework, like you said, we have come up with the bioethics, Islamic perspective, for the AI, for other politics also, for the social transformations as well. So in all these fields, then we need to look into what would the ijtihadic approach or not.
I think what we are doing is a kind of ijtihad in Islamic ethics, you know. So we have we designed in the program in Applied Islamic Ethics, we designed a course. It's entitled Islamic Ethics and Artificial Intelligence. We are trying to answer and address the contemporary questions related to artificial intelligence. We have another during the pandemic. I designed a course which is entitled Islamic Ethics and Pandemics.
Okay.
So we keep updating our curriculum to address, because still it is applied Islamic ethics. So still the space given for the applied courses is big, and then we have to address what's happening. So this is what we keep trying, and we have a course on human rights and migration and refugees. So because these are contemporary questions and we have to answer them systematically, and by benefiting from the classical discussions and the contemporary discussions at the same time.
True.
So we are open. This is why we differentiate between interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. See? So because we provide Islamic ethics as rooted in the Islamic tradition, but it's not just limited to the Islamic tradition.
Traditions,
But we say that it is rooted in the Islamic tradition.
With a broader.
We refuse the idea of disconnection. But at the same time, we refuse the idea of just being limited and restricted to the classical discussion.
True.
Yeah. So they say Al-Daghistani McIntyre, for example, is trying to revive Aristotelian philosophy. So, but it's not Aristotle is there. Aristotle is there, but it's his philosophy is not just restricting to Aristotelian philosophy. So, just one more point I think would clarify also the previous discussion with the
What's that?
Yes, well said. So, for example, the key idea of Aristotelian philosophy when it comes to the virtue ethics is moderation. Because, the definition of virtue is that the means between two extremes. Now, what is the mediation? How do you theorize mediation, التوسط or الاعتدال? It is a problematic issue in the Greek philosophy. And Ibn Taymiyyah came and criticized this idea, criticized Greek philosophy because they don't set limits systematically about what is the mediation. When do you reach the level of mediation and then to identify that you have acquired the virtue? But in my opinion, Sharia does. Sharia in which sense? In Islamic law here. In the very detailed systems about the actions, So, and this is very, very detailed in the books of fiqh, فروع فقهية, the fruits of the juristic fruits. So, when they set a very detailed schedule about the proper actions, and also adab. Etiquette, the etiquette general, adab general is almost about the proper behaviors.
More
in a very detailed way. So this is one of the ideas, to show you that, okay, we agree on the mediation, but what is the mediation? Then the Sharia or the Islamic law will contribute. And by the way, the Sufi answer would be different to the mediation. You see, so although that we agree sometimes on the very idea, but we differ in terms of the way that we explain and systematically regulate or answer this idea. So when we say Islamic ethics, it doesn't mean that it is radically different and there's no any common ground with other religious traditions, moral traditions. And this is one of the ideas that I criticized Al-Jabiri for, because I think that, he's always talking about parallel value systems. I think morality, there's a great space for human intellect when it comes to morality? Why do you assume that, this tradition copied this idea from this tradition, while at the same time you might assume that, there's a shared morality that all human beings as free, as beings that have free will and free rationality, they come to the same conclusion at the same time. For example, the very key idea of the Greek tradition, which is the Platonic idea, but the faculties of the soul, and the cardinal virtues. This idea, which is a Platonic idea, was accepted widely in the Islamic tradition and was integrated as part of some fiqhi sources and some legal theory sources and even some theological sources. How do you explain that? Because they conceive this idea as a shared rational tradition or heritage. So they didn't find any problem with integrating this idea. But the details would be different. The way that they address, they come to fulfill these ideas, it would be different. So we should not be, I think we should leave enough space for shared morality, that every human being over history, they share the same ideas sometimes when it comes to the morality. Because human reason has an essential role.
So the applications would be different.
Yeah, I have 3 questions. I'll try to keep it short. The first one goes back to what you just said, but also back to the comment from Syed Zimeri, basically on how to identify what Islamic ethic is, and also where potential for dialogue lies. And my first question would be if you could see potential in looking further into genres and not just sources and different types of sources, but because there seems to be distinctions between, now I'm working on Al-Ghazali and the Byzantine times, so I was trying to see if there is something similar to the adab genre. There seems to not be something similar, but at the same time we have example of 80% of Al-Ghazali being adapted by a Christian theologian, by Hebreus into Syriac. So there is a lot of adaptation, but there seems to be also still something distinct in this different traditions. So my question is, how should we theorize about this now without falling back into Orientalist assumptions? And I mean, I understand.
Theorize what?
Theorize the similarities and the differences
Between Al-Ghazali and
ethical systems. And I mean, for this, you could say that Greek is the common background, because what happens in the Greek tradition and what is widely accepted, if you're looking at like Christian theological analysis, it's basically that there is an adaptation of Platonist thought, but it becomes something entirely different. It becomes following a Christian paradigm, so which has been neglected in the way that mostly Westerners were looking at Islamic ethics first. So there has also been the same process when it came to the influence on Greek for Muslim thinkers or Islamic thought, right? It's also an adaptation process. It's a rewriting and not just a translation of concepts. So I'm wondering about how to transdisciplinary work on that now. Yeah, that's the first question. And the second question was, looking at page 15, you were arguing that there was what's it called, like a divergent type of ethics, which is Sufi ethics, which then became very dominant and influential, if we could say something more about that. And also, if you think that as a consequence, Islamic ethics would need power critical theories, which are looking into how counter counter ethics kind of become dominant ethics and vice versa? That's the second question. Yeah, then I think I'll leave it to that.
What is that in the page 15?
15, it's where you were saying that Sufism produced a divergent type of Islamic ethics, which eventually became more influential and almost dominated the Islamic world. So I was wondering about.
This is a quotation or?
Yeah, from you. Yeah.
A quotation,
Yes. You wrote this. No double quotation. Just saying. So I was wondering, looking into that, how would you say Islamic ethics?
I think this is part of the previous discussion. So it is attributed to someone.
Okay, I have to check more carefully then, but.
Maybe I was talking about Donaldson here.
Okay, but then the question still.
Anyway, okay.
Valid, I guess.
Yeah, the other.
Walter and Gibb, maybe it has to do with Walter and Gibbs.
Walter and Jeff. Yeah, Walter and Jeff. It was not my words. So I was referring, talking on explaining their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as for adaptation, I think it's not clear to me what do you mean by adab when you compare it with you try to to examine this in the work of Al-Ghazali. What do you mean exactly by adab?
That's another question. Which
because this term is problematic.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this is another question. What I was saying was that the question was raised by Syed Zimeri earlier. What is Islamic ethics, and do you identify ethics with sources? So my question was, could you identify Islamic ethics in that case, with different types of genres which are very specific? Like adab, for example.
I didn't restrict.
No. And then following from that, my argument was, or the question was basically, I was trying to find, since I was working on the book on marriage before, which has adab in its title, right, by Al-Ghazali for my master, and I was stumbling upon this very vast discussions of what adab actually means and what this genre entails, and so I was trying to see if in the Byzantine tradition there is something similar to the adab genre, and there isn't. There's a different set of genres. So I was wondering if it makes sense to work with genre as a comparison and not with value systems in the sense of Al-Jabiri did. Is that like a safe way out of essentializing something, basically?
Yeah, I think that identifying the source is very important in this context, not the author.
Yeah.
Because Al-Ghazali himself, when he writes on the same topic in a different work, then you have to contextualize the discussion in his book, because each book has a focus in his view. So, for example, if you would like to understand the fiqh approach to nikah or marriage, then the best example should be in the case of Al-Ghazali, his fiqh books, like Al-Wasit or Al-Wajiz or Al-Basit. Now, if you would like to understand the other dimensions beyond fiqh approach, then you have to go to Ihya al-Ulumuddin. Because Al-Ghazali, in his view, he's very clear about the focus that each book is taking. So when he writes in fiqh, he is a faqih. When he writes in philosophy, he is a philosopher. So he himself has a multifaceted approaches. Then it would be interesting to compare the same topic in several works that written by Al-Ghazali to examine these differences. This is just as a footnote on Al-Ghazali. As for the adaptation, I think the second point that I'm not saying that the only way to identify or define the conception of ethics is to identify the sources. I'm saying that there's a very strong link between both. So the way that you identify or define the concept, the way that you will identify the sources. But when it comes to the concept itself, I would say that, as I mentioned before, we are talking about three key elements when we talk about the focus of ethics: the actions, the character, and the sources. So we are among three different elements. So these three different elements will identify, to answer the point raised also by the other discussant. This definition will identify what is going to be included and excluded from the sources. How? Because, there are several disciplines addressing, partially or fully the character, like Sufism. It's almost about the character.
Yeah, the whole of Sufism is about more.
So Sufism would be included, or Sufi sources would be included here. Now, some dimensions or aspects or discussions in theology will be included as far as they are related to the actions or the ability or the sources. But this does not mean that theology will be ethics. No, still theology is still theology. And this is why I teach theological ethics, but not theology. And the first lecture I start with my students is that you have to differentiate between theological ethics and theology. And we differentiate in the first lecture. So, and the same with philosophical ethics. Philosophy is not ethics only. So this does not mean that to translate the whole discipline. No, but some aspects or discussions within theology will be considered as moral discussions, like the huge discussion on husn and qubh, good or right and wrong, or good or bad, or beauty and ugly. It depends on the way that you will translate these terms. So this puts you in the core discussion of ethics, which is related to meta-ethics, what we call it now, meta-ethics, in the modern terminology. Now, to prevent yourself or to be cautious in dealing with these issues, to not fall under the pre-assumptions or Western assumptions, Orientalist assumptions. So the history of ideas would be very helpful here.
Yeah.
So, but historicizing ideas is one thing, and also at the same time to examine the way that each author is trying to translate and I don't want to say Islamize, some foreign ideas is very important also.
And incorporate.
Yes, cooperated. Yeah, because they might quote some ideas, but they integrate these ideas in their whole system, intellectual system. And the way that they might quote these ideas because they found foundational scriptural sources or evidences that support the same understanding. So in this case, and this is the case with Al-Ghazali in so many examples, he found that the same idea that was said by Aristotle or Plato, whatever, he found prophetic reports, agreeing with the same idea, identical with the same ideas. Then he will adopt this idea by quoting the prophetic reports. I traced him in several examples. He does this. The same, for example, with Al-Raghib al-Asfahani. The one Al-Ghazali was much interested in his work. And it was said that he usually accompany his book, Dhari'a ila Makarim Sharia. So Dhari'a ila Makarim Sharia, because you have to consider that Al-Raghib al-Asfahani is an encyclopedic scholar who wrote a Quran commentary, a commentary on the Quran, and he wrote several works in adab and philosophy, and he wrote not just a Quran commentary, he wrote also al-Mufadat fi Mufadat al-Quran, the Quranic lexicon. So someone like Al-Raghib al-Asfahani, he is very immersed in the Quranic discourse and Quranic text. Then when he deals with philosophy, Greek philosophy, then when he adopts some ideas, for sure that he has evidences that they are similar to, and they are supported by scriptural evidences, for example. You see, this is another point.
Sayed, go ahead. You have a raised hand. Just keep it, unmute, keep it brief because we're over time already.
I know. Sorry. I mean, it's so much to discuss. Really, it's like it's Sam. You should have made this like 2 hours, 3 hours. You know. Okay. I mean, honestly,
we can meet and discuss it.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to. Absolutely. I think there are so many. No, there are so many issues raised and so many like philosophical questions which I would have really wanted to listen. Like to have an answer from you, a more detailed answer, perhaps, you know. No, regarding, I am very much interested, you know, this division between theological, for example, or any other, and philosophical ethics, you know. So in a certain sense, I understand this as a theological approach to ethics. So it's not theology, but we use theological presupposition to understand ethics, and philosophical is a type of, as a philosophical thinking about ethical issues, ethical problems, about the character, about what's the right action, what's the wrong action, you know. So in this sense, I totally understand that expansive approach. You know, you could have an adab perspective on ethics. Yes, you could have you know, a poetry approach. I mean, more or less, it could be infinite, you know, the approach. So, but nevertheless, there is some sort of, to put it in Aristotelian content, there's a certain formal features. And what I'm looking for when I speak about ethics is really these formal features, which are in a certain sense common to all traditions, regardless whether they are Islamic or non-Islamic, or any other tradition, yeah, for that matter. So that is what, so sort of, I understand the material can change from one tradition to the other, but the formal features, I think we should perhaps focus more on that, because that's the where kind of ethics manifests itself as ethics, or as ethical, as being somehow distinct from many other, for example, from adab, from law, from, you know, so and so on and so on. So ethics as a discipline, I also understand, for example, when you speak of ethics as a discipline, we can, in a very loose sense, perhaps speak of Islamic ethics. I would have preferred the Muslim ethics in this case, you know, basically meaning that Muslim ethics is studies, which studies ethics in Muslim cultures, you know, as it manifests itself in different. And then we have all these sources, you know, well, however the Al-Ghazali understood, or however, you know, all the others that you have mentioned, Miskawayhi, and they sort of their approaches to this ethics and what they understood. So I think then it would be like, but this type of ethics for me, this would be like, well, a historical approach to the branch of study that we call ethics, as it has manifested itself in this culture. So that is one sphere. I mean, I could go along with that, definitely. But I am not sure if I would go. And also, like, I seem to be certain confusions there. I think, for example, when you speak of ethics, theological ethics and philosophical ethics, and ethics of something, we can talk about ethics, research ethics, for example. We can talk about the ethics of environment, you know, or how we approach the environment, ethics of medicine. So these are very really different things. One is we already have a certain conception of ethics, and then we apply that ethics to certain field. And the other is the ethics as is colored, so to speak, takes the perspective of a certain subdiscipline like theology or philosophy. Also, one question, which is really regarding, you went quite a bit about, for example, the question about the virtue and the character, khuluq, akhlaq, you know, and I agree with you I think I agree entirely with you about that, you know. For example, if you take the attitude of, if you are a coward person, yes. So that, according to Aristotle, is a vice, yes. It's a vice which stands somehow between courage and recklessness. No, sorry. I confused it. Courage is the virtue which stands between cowardice and recklessness. Yes, so being a courageous person is, in a certain sense, having the virtue of courage, and this definitely, I would agree with you, is really very much culturally determined. Not completely, otherwise we would lose the thread of what constitutes the formal thread of what constitutes a virtue formally, but materially I would say that this definitely is part of how a culture sees courage. I mean, what may be courageous in Norway may not necessarily be courageous in a desert, in Sahara, for example, somewhere. Yes, so these are all very culturally specific things. So my question then is really, when you put it down where you got, I still nevertheless struggling to understand how we identify Muslim ethics. If we mean by ethics something that is courage, if you mean by ethics something more than what I just laid out there as a discipline where we study these different people have written about ethics, and they have said different things about ethics. That is, this type of plurality, this is not specific to Muslim ethics, of course. It's also very true of Western ethics and Indian ethics, and all traditions have contributed in this expansive sense. So, but is there another sense that you mean by ethics beyond this, what I mentioned?
Yes,
very briefly.
Yes, very briefly. We might. I know. I know the difference between ethics of something like ethics of medicine and theological ethics or philosophical ethics. So, and there's no space, no time for going further in this discussion. This is number one. Number two, as for the Islamic ethics, not Muslim ethics. As for the Islamic ethics, it is clearly that it is centered on the scripture, Quran and Hadith, and it was integrated and part of the Islamic sciences. Is this sufficient enough to identify Islamic ethics?
Yeah, as a discipline, yes. As a discipline,
yeah, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So it is, all the discussions, the way that ethics was discussed and the way that every discipline, Islamic discipline, contributed to theorizing ethics, it will be considered Islamic ethics.
Yeah.
So fiqh, Sufism, adab, etc. Islamic legal theory and Quran commentaries, Hadith.
Adab, all kinds of adab? Because there would be many adabs which were not Islamic sciences.
There's another discussion about this because I disagree with Armando Salvatore and others who are trying to secularize the concept of adab and to show that it represents the secularism in the Islamic. I disagree with this because even when you deal with Ibn Qutayba, for example, in his book Uyun al-Akhbar, so Ibn Qutayba died 276, and he is a great scholar in the Islamic theology and wrote several works. When he wrote this book, which is classified under adab, he integrated several traditions, but with keeping the main narrative based on Sharia. And this is why you find a lot of prophetic reports in the book and the Quranic verses, and he cannot separate himself from his Islamic knowledge as an Islamic scholar. So I disagree with reading him and others, as secular approaches to
as a non-Quranic.
Yes. Yeah.
On that note, thank you again, Professor Al-Khatib. Thank you again, Dr. Zimeri, for your contribution and questions. Thank you also for our audience online. Again, this seminar has been organized by the Critical Islamic Studies Collective in collaboration with the Islamic Studies Seminar at CTR at Lund University. We will follow up and do the recording will be posted online. Please do follow up and do reach us for any questions or comments. Thank you again, everyone. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.